Dr. Nogueira, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. How do you interpret Justice Lewis Fuchs' lone vote to absolve Bolsonaro on jurisdictional and evidentiary grounds, arguing lack of proof, improper venue, and unmanageable case files within Brazil's broader debates on lawfare, even as a majority of the Brazil's Supreme Federal Court, STF, has now convicted Bolsonaro for leading a criminal organization to plot a coup? Could Fuchs' reasoning still provide legal ammunition for appeals, annulment claims, or retrial efforts?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here discussing this with you. Well, for anyone following the trial closely, Fuchs's vote was not a surprise because he has been signaling this divergence with the reporting judge Moraes for a while. That said, his vote was surprising considering his prior positions in the trial of the participants of the invasion of the Congress on 8 January 2023 and his overall trajectory in the Supreme Court. So it was surprising thinking about his own trajectory rather than, what was expected of him in the trial. I think he attempted to give a technical veneer to an 11-hour vote that was eminently political. His judgment essentially changed depending on who is being accused. And he was clearly speaking to the wider audience rather than to his peers. But I don't see his lone vote as an issue, but rather the contrary. In a democracy with functioning institutions, dissent is part of the process. And the fact that Fuchs was able to do so, to voice his dissent, contrary to what the far right argues, shows that there isn't a dictatorship in Brazil. Because in a dictatorship, he wouldn't be allowed to voice dissent, or he would have faced persecution for doing so. Neither of those things happened. What happened is that he's facing criticism from part of the public and being celebrated by others, which is not abnormal in any sense. But I don't think his vote changes anything. At the end of the day, Bolsonaro and his co-conspirators were convicted, and I believe rightly so. But in a highly politicized trial such as this, of course, that Bolsonaro supporters will pick on anything to try and twist the facts to argue for his innocence, but legally, so they will push as far as they can. But in the current context, I don't see how this trial could be overturned, even if it went to the plenary. That said, a future annulment would obviously depend on how the political landscape in Brazil changes in the next few years, and it's very hard to predict, in my opinion, because the Supreme Court is not isolated from the wider political climate, and changes in the composition of the court under, for instance, a future far-right government could have consequences, right? So, and we only need to look at the US to see what that looks like. But I think that by convicting Bolsonaro, we are doing what the US should have done with Trump and going into the right direction towards, I think, democracy.
Right. With the STF asserting unprecedented authority, convicting a former president and top generals, placing Bolsonaro under house arrest, and wading into disinformation inquiries, does this expanded role bolster democratic resilience or risk normalizing states of exception that revanchist actors can exploit as evidence of judicial dictatorship?
As I already mentioned, by looking at the US, you can see the consequences of what not persecuting an attempted coup d'etat looks like. The US now has a president with a precedent authority backed by a Congress that is essentially by his side and a very politically aligned Supreme Court. So you can ask, where are the checks and balances in the democratic rule in the US right now? Of course, I'm not an expert in American politics, but the current state of affairs seems to imply that the US president can do as he pleases, including attempts to influence judicial proceedings in a foreign country like he's trying to do in Brazil. I think that the evidence that Bolsonaro and his conspirators attempted a coup d'etat is hard to ignore. So when a crime like that is committed, it needs to be punished. And the Supreme Court is not overstepping, but rather doing its role. And I see it with good eyes that not only a former president, but also the military are, for the first time in Brazil's history, being convicted for attempting to abolish the democratic rule of law. And perhaps I think Brazil would have had a different history if that was done sooner, for instance, right? But as I said previously, the right wing, the far right will attempt to explore what happened, to paint a picture that we live in, as you say, a judicial dictatorship. But what they want in this case, I think it's impunity. The revenge is already in place, right, with the Congress right now voting to expand its protection against legal prosecution, for instance. There is also the discussion about a bill at the moment aimed at the participants of 8 January. This bill is nicknamed the Amnesty Bill, when it should be named, in my opinion, the Impunity Bill as well, because what the Congress is trying to do is reinterpret the notion of amnesty to appease a political group and perhaps set what I believe would be a very dangerous precedent. This idea that Fuchs talked about in his speech, that the 8th of January participants were a disorganized or unruly mob, is preposterous and ignores the whole context in which the Congress invasion happened. Yes, they were unable to overthrow the state, thank God, but themselves, because the reminder of the plot didn't work out, and their leader, Bolsonaro, knowing that the plan had failed, had fled to the US. All that said, I'm not a super optimistic person, and I am not a big fan of the kind of worshipping that judges of the Supreme Court are receiving. But in this instance, I think they are performing their duty, which is safeguard democratic rule of law in the country. A dictatorship would imply the suppression of other powers and an authoritarian ruler, and this is not what's happening in Brazil right now. And only, I think, those living in far-right bubbles will have that interpretation of the context.
All right. The conviction encompassed senior military officers for the first time since 64-85 dictatorship. How does this reshape Brazil's civil-military relations, especially in a context where armed forces remain politically salient and segments of society view them as guarantors of order?
I think that's quite an interesting point, because I don't know if you know, but historically the military has been behind all the successful coups in Brazil, and there have been a few. So as I already mentioned, I see it positively that after so many other instances, the military is finally facing legal consequences for its actions. And I've been following the media coverage for the trial very closely, and I don't think, at least from my perspective, that this has been a major point of discussion. As far as I can tell, there is no crisis at the moment between the government and the military, or between the Supreme Court and the military. And perhaps that has to do with the surprising fact that the military had an important role in preventing this particular coup d'etat from being successful, right? Just one of the commanders of the military, Almir Garnier, who was the commander of the Navy under Bolsonaro, was convicted, because out of the 3 military commanders, he was the only one who went along with the plan. And for many analysts, the coup was not successful because it didn't have the support of the Army and the Air Force commanders, who refused to join the plot. Of course, I mean, they could have done more than just say no, and could have denounced the coup, which would give even more credibility to the trial. But perhaps, you know, their role in this case was positive. And I think that might have to do with the fact that the coup didn't succeed, and also that the military is not being the focus of the media coverage or the discussions so much.
Right. As school curricula, memorials, and policing doctrines institutionalize 8 January 2023, how do these memory practices shape collective political identities? Do they inoculate against authoritarian relapse, or entrench binary cleavages that revanchist actors can instrumentalize?
I think it's very soon to say how this particular event will be narrated in Brazilian history, right? That's yet to be seen. But if you take, for instance, the 1964 military coup, the military until this day celebrate the day of the coup as, you know, the day of the revolution, right? They call it the revolution rather than the military coup. And Bolsonaro himself has praised eminent members of the military dictatorship, such as General Ustra, who was notorious for leading torture and repression during this period. But I think the dominant view of 1964 currently is that it was a coup d'etat, which installed a violent dictatorship in this country, and that has ended actually quite recently, 1985, as you say. It's not the only view, but it's the one that students, for instance, will learn about in school, right? As I said, democracy in Brazil is still young, and one might say is still quite fragile. I see Bolsonaro's victory in 2018, despite his authoritarian rhetoric, as a sign that it's still fragile. I see the fact that him and his co-conspirators felt emboldened enough to attempt a coup also shows how democracy is fragile. But I don't see his conviction as, you know, a demonstration of that fragility. On the contrary, in this instance, I see his conviction as a sign that democratic institutions are working despite the fragility. I am, like a lot of other social scientists and observers, concerned with the political cleavages in Brazil, but I don't think this is a unique feature of Brazil right now. The far right is on the rise globally, and one could ask, for instance, if 8 January in Brazil would have happened if the Capitol invasion hadn't happened in the US, or if the real leaders of the Capitol invasion had been punished. And one could also ask what would have happened if Trump had been the US president in 2023, right? I think punishment here in the case of Brazil does not, as you say, inoculate against authoritarian relapse, but it does send a message that it's not okay to plan a coup d'etat, and if you do so, you will face charges for it. And I think that's a good message that the country is sort of showing to the world right now.
Right. Building on your work on entitled anger, how is middle-class resentment mobilized around the trial, particularly in claims that STF has usurped sovereignty and thwarted the popular will?
Yeah, my work on revanchist populism and entitled anger is about the rise of far-right populism globally, and particularly in the global south. Revanchist populism is a term that I coined with my colleague Ryan Sentner. And what we are doing with this is describing what we see as a turn in political imaginations towards the retaking of the nation in line with a power discourse of the people and righteousness. And we see this mapping on to populations who nostalgically sense they have lost what was rightfully morally theirs, which might be regained by applying an angry sense of entitlement to an authoritative and often authoritarian exercise of government. In this context, the Brazilian middle class has been particularly described as resentful and an important support base for the far right. But I don't think alone middle class resentment can explain recent political cleavages in Brazil. Going back to your question more specifically, as I already mentioned, of course, the Supreme Court decision will be mobilized by the far right to fuel particular understandings of the current political situation in Brazil. And there is a group of die-hard Bolsonaro supporters that will buy into any narrative that the far right leaders produce. But I don't think the future of Brazilian politics depends on this particular group, but more on the voters who are moderate and will swing their vote depending on a broader understanding of the situation. I think it's clear from his more recent speeches that the current São Paulo governor, Tarcísio de Freitas, is trying to position himself as the heir of Bolsonaro's political capital and the natural candidate of the far right in the next presidential election. I think some of Bolsonaro's electorate will naturally transfer to whoever he decides to support, and that is significant, but not enough to win the next election, in my opinion. We have to remember that Bolsonaro himself lost the election, last election to Lula by a small margin, of course, but he still lost. So what I think is under dispute is the interpretation of current events by this more general population who are not loyal to either Lula or Bolsonaro. And it's interesting that you touch on sovereignty because it's a very hot topic in Brazil at the moment, but not because I think of the Supreme Court decision, but because of Trump's attempt to mess with the judicial process in Brazil. Lula's popularity recently has slightly increased because he was gifted this position of the defender of Brazil's sovereignty in response to Eduardo Bolsonaro's lobby that led to Trump raising tariffs on Brazil products to 50%. So I think in this context, it's hard for the far right now to play that card of sovereignty while they're conspiring with Trump to penalize Brazil's economy.
Right. What spatial patterns, capitals versus peripheries, south-southeast, north-northeast, do you observe in post-verdict mobilizations, and how do they map onto Brazil's longer histories of regional inequality and uneven development?
Oh, I don't have the data to comment on that specifically, right? About the sort of geography of how people are reacting to the trial. But I think that if we look at Bolsonaro's 2018 election and when he was victorious, we can find some evidence of the geographies of far-right voters and supporters in Brazil, and the work of Matthew Richmond and Lisa McKenna, who are colleagues of mine, have done this work of kind of like looking into the geography of the votes in 2018. And the interesting thing here is because unlike the US, or if you look, for instance, in the case of the UK and Brexit, the geography of the vote in the case of Brazil is not the traditional urban versus rural kind of pattern. What their work pointed out is that the votes of the urban pool have been decisive in the last elections in Brazil. The vote of particularly the urban pool in the peripheries of big cities in Brazil have been swinging between the left towards the right throughout the years, and the explanation for this has to do with major changes in Brazilian society, from the growth of the evangelical church influence to enduring criminality, which affects the urban poor, for instance, more prominently. In my own work, I have focused on the changes in the global labor market and how they also play a role in the new political landscape that breeds the far right. Again, if you think of the case of the US and the UK, you have the industrialization and the loss of stable jobs alongside austerity and neoliberalism, which has impoverished particular groups. And then immigration in these cases has been the kind of far-right scapegoat to try and get to convert this entitled anger into votes, essentially. In the case of Brazil, we have historically a very stratified labor market with lots of precarity, and this has also been growing as a consequence of neoliberalism and the industrialization. But the traditional
Right.
left in Brazil grew out of industrial trade unionism, and now there is this huge population of workers outside formal wage relations that don't feel represented by this traditional left-wing narratives. So when you think about geography, these spatial inequalities interact with this wider social and economic dynamics. And I think my point is that if progressive politics doesn't find ways to speak to this new workforce, far-right narratives offering simple solutions to complex problems can fill this gap, essentially.
Right. With Bolsonaro confined to house arrest and restricted from social media, how has the street platform nexus of contention shifted, especially regarding plazas, evangelical pulpits, WhatsApp, Telegram ecosystems, and diaspora mobilization in the United States?
I think all the arenas you mentioned have been part of the political landscape in Brazil already. So, and the far right has been very good capitalizing on social media, perhaps because of their extreme language and rhetoric, which is very much suited for generating engagement, which is what feeds social media. I don't see a change in this scenario with with Bolsonaro's arrest. I think the main question at the moment, as I already said, is who will inherit Bolsonaro's political capital and represent this far-right group in the next election.
Right. How does the trial intersect with politics of informal work and gig economy? Are precarious workers, street vendors, delivery app couriers recalibrating their partisan attachments in the light of conviction or holding steady?
Again, I think it's very soon to say how particular groups of workers are reacting to the trial, right? We don't have the data. But as I already mentioned, I think that this mass of precarious works that characterizes Brazil's economy play a key role in current affairs. Of course, they are more than workers, and they have other affiliations that might also impact their political behavior. But the point that I have been trying to make in my own work is that this group feels underrepresented in political debates. The left tends to see informality uniquely as an issue, as precarity, as exploitation, and their responses to the growing changes in the experiences of work have been inadequate. In my research, I focus on street vendors who are criminalized by local governments and feel attacked by exclusionary policies that constrain their ability to work on the streets and gain a livelihood. The left's response has been to insist on wage work and development as solutions that will eventually incorporate everyone into the regular labor market, but workers are not necessarily on board with that, and people's desires for autonomy and flexibility are taken in this context as sort of negatively as signs that these workers have been indoctrinated by neoliberalism. But I think what we need to understand is that for a huge proportion of people in Brazil, wage work was historically either unattainable or represented a precarious inclusion through low-paying jobs where people have to deal with extraneous hours and more often than not harassment and humiliation even. I think for many, the far-right promise of disruption feels like a real hope for change. Globally, the far-right has succeeded in large part because it taps into real suffering and mobilizes real frustration by offering hope for disruption. And in some ways, the left has become the conservative sort of political force, protecting sometimes abstract values that do not necessarily resonate with people's struggles, everyday struggles. I think the new realities of the labor market and of society at large demand more bold thinking and out-of-the-box policies that can address the challenges of people's lived realities. And I think, for instance, Mandani's political platform for the New York City mayor election is a good representation of what I'm talking about. In Belo Horizonte, Brazil, where I do most of my research, there is a bill which is going into vote to implement a free bus fare, which is a very interesting thing as well. So I think there are some interesting things happening, and I think there is a progressive way out of this tough political landscape that we are living through.
Right. Within Bolsonaro's coalition, how are key pillars, evangelical leaders, police unions, agribusiness lobbies, military clubs, reframing their narratives after the verdict? What does this suggest about the durability or recomposition of his revanchist base?
I think it's an interesting question. Like one day after Bolsonaro's conviction, the Folha de São Paulo, which is one of Brazil's more important newspapers, had this headline on the twin deficit in Brazil, and the dangers of Lula's third mandate for the economy. I think what happened essentially is that Bolsonaro had become an issue, and his conviction was applauded by the large media because they wanted him out of the presidential race. But the big players that you mentioned also don't want, I think, a fourth Lula mandate. So essentially what happened in the lead up to the 2022 election, there was a kind of an attempt to create, by the big media, to create this kind of third way, to construct this idea of a third way. And some had hoped, for instance, that Doria, who was a former governor of São Paulo, or even Luciano Huck, which is like a famous TV presenter in Brazil, would be a presidential candidate and represent this third way and overcome Brazil's current polarization. But that didn't happen, and I do not see it happening in 2026 either. I think what will happen is a repositioning of political support. And Tarcísio, who's the current governor of São Paulo, seems to be the natural choice to replace Bolsonaro as Lula's main opposition in this polarized kind of economic political landscape. But I think he will have a very difficult task in his political campaign, which is essentially pay homage to Bolsonaro and then capitalize on his support at the same time as he tries to present himself as a more moderate candidate and market-friendly kind of politician. I think it will be a hard act for him to pull off, and how successful he is will also depend on what happens in Brazil between now and the election. But I think there's a feeling that the presidential race has already started in a way, and PT, Lula's party, is treating Tarcísio currently as the main opposition, I think.
Right. Do you observe unequal graduations of culpability between 8 January foot soldiers and political principles that echo Brazil's broader selective enforcement of law, thereby reinforcing perceptions of institutional bias?
I don't think so. I think like I mean, I keep going back to the US, but I think it's a useful parallel. I think that happened in the US, right? You had, as you say, the foot soldiers of the Capitol invasion going to jail, and Trump not only remaining free, but also being allowed to run for president and becoming president again. I think if there is any echo of that in Brazil is in Fuchs's vote, that, as I said in the beginning, like he voted for, culpability for the 8 January invaders, but now has acquitted Bolsonaro. So his vote represents a bit of that. But I think that the Supreme Court decision has been coherent in the sense of condemning both the foot soldiers, but also what they perceive to be the leaders of this movement.
All right. And lastly, Bolsonaro's defenses, claims of witch hunts, persecution, procedural overload resonate with Trumpist repertoires. Where do Brazilian specificities, evangelical media ecosystems, military memory, police syndicates create distinct discursive frames?
I think like in terms of the rhetoric, I think Bolsonaro's entire act is very much aligned with Trump's, right? So I don't see a lot of difference there. But of course, like the content and how he speaks to his political base is, as you say, shaped by the Brazilian specificities, particularly, the conservatism of his political supporters. And so the differences between Brazil and the US have to do more with this kind of essentially different composition of the two societies, and both in terms of the social, economic, cultural, and as we already discussed, the geographical composition of Brazil and how it differs from the US. But I think in terms of discursive frames, there is a kind of right-wing kind of rhetoric that is being sort of, which is common to different kind of political leaders in this political spectrum, and modulated to kind of speak to particular kind of groups of supporters shaped by their sort of cultural and in the case of Brazil, religious kind of positions within society.
Right. Dr. Nogueira, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.